So monofloral honey is defined in regulations actually as a honey that is made wholly or mainly from the nectar of one plant. So the bees will be visiting one type of plant. So you can imagine that if you put a beehive in the middle of a field that's only growing one particular crop, let's say rape, oilseed rape, then you would end up with a monofloral rape honey, because that's what the bees are feeding on. And we get that with things like manuka. So in New Zealand there are plantations and places where people have actually deliberately grown manuka, so that they can produce manuka honey, and they're very well managed. So the bee farmers will go out and they'll clear the land of any other type of flower to make sure that their final honey product is genuine manuka honey.
You are listening to Farm to Fork, a series from The Standard Show, the podcast that brings you the stories behind the standards with Matthew Childs and Cindy Parakill. Today's episode is on food consumption. The
opposite or the other side of that is a polyfloral honey, and most of the honey that we eat is polyfloral. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. But that tends to be from a mixture of different plant sources. So that's where the bees have had the opportunity to forage on many different types of flower, and the nectar from those different flowers come together into one product. So you can end up with something called a multifloral manuka honey, for example, but that's a blend of lots of different nectar types, including manuka. So what we're trying to do with the standards aspect of manuka is to try and define very clearly what a monofloral manuka honey looks like, and that involves managing the bee colonies probably a little bit more carefully than for some of the lower value products.
Where are we, Cindy Parakill?
Well, Matthew Charles, we're here again in our usual place for this series at the To Love Tea and Coffee House in London's Battersea, just down the road from Clapham Junction, and we're having our tea and coffee and cake.
Yes, we are, and this time I've gone for a rather lovely looking Bakewell tart. What have you gone for, Cindy?
Well, I have gone for a date slice.
That does look good. Well, we are out having tea and coffee and cake and basing ourselves here again at the To Love Tea and Coffee House because this is Farm to Fork, our series on the relationship between standards and food.
Now, in this series, our menu of episodes is loosely following the food cycle of food innovation, production, packaging, distribution, consumption, and waste management, and featuring some of the key standards involved in each of them. And in this episode, we are looking at food consumption. But actually, we need to come clean and fess up, don't we, Matthew?
We do. Now that is the genuine sound in the background there of a slice of Clapham Battersea cafe culture and the To Love Tea and Coffee House, but we're not actually there, are we, Cindy?
Sadly not.
We had planned to be having tea and cake face to face in our usual location for this series, but unfortunately reasons means that it's not possible. But I have actually got a piece of cake, and Cindy, you do have a piece of cake in front of you there, don't
Exactly,
you?
a date cake.
And where are you in fact then, Cindy?
I'm at home in West London. Where are you?
You were there. I'm at home, but in South East London.
Sweet.
Yes, sweet, because we are genuinely having cake, and in this episode covering out something else that's also sweet, and that is honey. Playing us in at the top of the episode was Adrian Charlton, principal scientist from the organisation FERA Science. I spoke to Adrian about some of the issues around the testing of food and the authenticity of food, and in particular for honey, and even more particular, manuka honey, and a new standard being developed for it.
Yes, indeed. A PAS, in fact. Now, throughout the Farm to Fork series and this episode, we are of course exploring the role of standards. So before we hear Matthew's conversation with Adrian, here's Sarah Walton from BSI to tell us more about the general relationship between standards and food consumption.
Hi, my name is Sarah Walton and I'm the food sector lead at BSI. For people to truly enjoy what they're eating and drinking, taste is a key consideration, but so is the ability to trust that it's made of what the label actually says it's made of, and that it's made ethically and with as little of an environmental impact as possible. With food fraud in the headlines and labelling becoming more confusing than helpful, skeptical consumers might doubt what they find on the shelves or online. And this is where standards come in. Standards reassure consumers and organisations about the specific characteristic of a product. They can ensure that the product is produced in compliance with key aspects of a food, from purity and origin to environmental and fair production practices. All of these factors directly affect consumer buying decisions, and ultimately standards help food sector organisations to improve consumers' trust in their products. So that's why for all parts of the food cycle, including consumption, standards provide a way for everyone to agree what good looks like.
Now, here on The Standard Show, we really welcome your feedback. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts, especially if you listen to us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can find and follow us on Twitter @Standard Show and on Instagram @The Standard Show. And check out the show notes for all of the ways to get in touch.
So, Adrian Charlton is Principal Scientist at FERA Science, an international food research and testing organisation. He's also a standards maker, a member of ISO Technical Committee 34, Subcommittee 19, responsible for the standardisation of bee products. In this first slice of my conversation with Adrian, I started by asking him to tell me more about FERA Science and the role it plays in food safety.
FERA Science is an organisation that's based in the north of England. We're based just outside York. We've been around for over 100 years, originally set up at various different laboratory sites across the UK, looking into things such as plants, pests and diseases. But we were brought together as a unified organisation in about 1991, where all the labs were brought together in this laboratory complex in York. And that included people who were working on food science, which is where I sit within the organisation, within the food programme. We also have a programme that works on environmental safety and stewardship, and the plant group as well, which continues that 100-year-long work on plant pathology. We also have a group within the organisation that looks at something called proficiency testing, which is working out how well other organisations are performing in terms of their testing and monitoring for risks in the food chain. So FERA as an organisation is designed to look at the safety of the food chain from farm to fork, really. Taking the risks that might come through contaminated soil and looking at that right through to food production and what we actually put on our plates, but then ultimately as well looking at the waste that we generate from overproducing food, or and how we dispose of that and packaging material as well, that sort of thing, and how that has an impact on the environment.
I'll come back to the role that FERA Science plays within food safety. You mentioned there about the food that arrives on our plates, but your involvement in standards. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so we've been working with BSI as an organisation. FERA have been working with BSI for the last 5 or 6 years to look at an opportunity that we recognise within the food sector to provide an assurance programme for food, and this is. It's very diverse in its nature and the way that it might operate. But one of the things that we've had an eye on is what will the UK need to do once we've had to establish our own rules post being a member of the European Union. And one of the things that we will lose by not being in the European Union is access to some of the protection mechanisms for food, things such as PDO and PGI, which are protected denomination of origin, that sort of thing. That they're markers to say that a product is where it comes from, and that's a European system. So we've been looking at how we can use standards to quality assure British products, but also that's broadened out to look at how we can make sure that safety standards are maintained in terms of the food that we eat in this UK, whether it's produced in the UK or whether it's imported. So we've been working internationally as well, and working with BSI and having that big international footprint is really helping us to have the conversations that we need to have, whether that be with the regulators and people within government whose responsibility it is to make sure that we've got the safe food chain, or whether it's the producers and the retailers who are selling food and have the traceability right back to the products that come out of the ground or graze on our grasslands. So the standard side of it is to provide people with assurance, really, that the food that we're eating is of a high standard, be that from an animal welfare point of view, a food safety point of view, moving forwards.
And that issue of food safety then generally, Adrian, what's the role of FERA science in ensuring this safety? And I mean, alongside that, who else is involved in the UK? And I suppose I'm keen to know how it all sort of fits together.
So FERA's it's one of the national reference laboratories in the UK, and the national reference laboratory capability is shared between a number of organisations. But we have that responsibility for a lot of the key areas around food, and particularly the safety of food. And what that means is that NRL role means that we're responsible for holding together the resilience of the UK to any threats that come through from the food chain, and particularly in respect to the things that we have the NRL status for. So that will be things such as pesticides and contaminants in general, and things such as heavy metals, that sort of thing, which you can talk about in a bit more detail in a second. But that infrastructure that I'm talking about will link into some of the smaller laboratories. Maybe it's the public analyst laboratories that operate regionally on behalf of the trading standards bodies. So if there's a problem in a particular area, then testing usually is done locally, and that's organised ultimately by the Food Standards Agency. So it links together as a network. We provide the technical expertise into that, really, to make sure that methods of analysis are at the right standard, that people are trained to the right level, and that if anything new's coming through, new technologies are coming through, or any new methods that we might have developed at FERA, that there is a natural way of rolling those out into the public analyst community.
So, Adrian, we talked there generally around the sort of food safety issues, the sort of food safety infrastructure generally, but we've asked you onto the Standard Show to talk about honey in particular. So tell me first about your relationship with honey.
I work fairly closely with the UK honey industry and with the regulators who look after honey. Honey it's an unusual product because it's a product of animal origin. So some of the considerations that we have are similar to what you would have for cows and for sheep. In as much as we have to monitor honey for things like antibiotics, because bees get diseases. So occasionally there's a need to use antibiotics to treat the colonies to make sure that the bees survive. And we want to make sure that those sorts of chemicals don't get into honey. So the link between FERA, what FERA do, and the honey world is around safety testing for things like veterinary medicines, antibiotics I've mentioned, but also other things as well. We want to make sure that people aren't using artificial stimulants or anything like that to improve the productivity. Honey is seen very much as a natural product, and also you can inadvertently introduce things like pesticides into honey. The bees forage on land where potentially spraying's been happening for crops and for valid reasons, but you certainly don't want those pesticides ending up in the honey. So we monitor for those as well. There's also potentially a risk if the hives are in the wrong place, then you can get contamination through the environment. So contaminated drinking water if the hive's next to a polluted lake, for example, and the bees are drinking out of that lake, or if there's just heavy traffic in the area and there might be pollution from lead or whatever else it might be. So you have to be careful where you position the hives, and we check for that sort of thing. We check for heavy metals in honey as well. So we make sure that it's a product that's fit for purpose. And I think, again, because we've got less control over honey than perhaps some other things. If you're growing a crop in the ground, you pretty much know what the environment is. For bees, we can manage the environment to some extent around the beehive, but we can't control all of the variables. So we do have to test honey fairly rigorously to make sure that there are no issues with it.
I was kind of thinking about that because many people might think that honey is a relatively benign product. You talk there about obviously a natural product, but what are the particular food safety issues then regarding honey, and why should we care about them? I suppose.
But if we look internationally, we're a UK-based lab, but we do work internationally. There are issues with some of the toxins that come out of plants that the bees forage on. So I guess if you consider that bees are actually wild, and although we're farming them, they are left to roam, over their natural range. So they can actually get onto flowers that perhaps we don't want them to, and that can introduce toxins into the honey. So internationally, there's problems with a compound called tutin in New Zealand, where the particular flower produces this toxin, and the toxin gets into the honey potentially if the bees go and forage on it. In this country, we have problems with alkaloids getting into honey from ragwort if the bees are foraging on wildflowers, that sort of thing. So we have to be fairly careful with it, and it's because there are very few truly sort of wild products, and honey can be considered to be that if if it's not in a managed apiary. So we've got concerns over how the bees are managed, and that's monitored very closely as well. And that's out of the same site that we're in York. There's something called the National Bee Unit, where we have a group of bee inspectors who go out and make sure that beekeepers are doing the right thing. That if there is any ragwort in the local area, that gets spotted and removed, and that they have declared all the veterinary medicines that they've used for treating the bees. So it's a highly regulated process.
I just wonder, Adrian, as you're talking there, how global is the market for honey? Is it a truly international market?
It is, and it's quite interesting when you get into the details, because most countries consume honey. It's a product that you'll find in almost every country, and there's a lot of trading goes on between countries because it's a seasonal product. Then at different times of year you can source honey from different parts of the world, and there's some countries that trade huge amounts of honey. We import most of our honey in the UK from China, for example, and that's blended with honeys from different parts of the world. So the blending process is interesting because we trade with many different countries to produce the blended products that we generally eat in this country. And that they're blended for good reasons, in much the same way as a whiskey might be blended to give it a particular colour or flavour. That's why honey's blended to give it the right properties. The viscosity can be important. But back to the question about the market size, it's a multi-million-pound industry globally with some key operators. India is a big producer of honey. We see quite a lot in Europe, in and around Europe. Turkey's a big player in the honey space as well. And so it truly is a commodity market for honey as much as anything, but it has to be managed. It's very different because it has to be managed almost like a cottage industry because of the way that it's produced. So it's both extremes. It's a global business that's managed very, very closely.
I'm just wondering, as you were talking earlier about some of the sort of food safety challenges there in terms of pesticides and things like that, what implication does that have then for honey being traded across borders?
So this is one of the key issues. Now we've moved to a phase where we're looking at signing up to trade deals and also just facilitating trade with countries that we might not have traded with before. For all food, not just honey, we need to make sure that food that's imported into the UK meets the safety standards that we would expect in the UK. And we have found issues where safety standards are not as high in countries that are wanting to export products into the UK. It's not necessarily that we've found pesticides and heavy metals and veterinary medicines and that sort of thing, or even natural toxins like tutin. We've not necessarily found them, but if they're not being monitored and the infrastructure isn't in place in those countries, then there's a huge risk to the UK by accepting imports from countries that we've not traditionally got a trading relationship with. So part of the process that we need to go through when we start agreeing to accept food from countries that we haven't previously had a big trading relationship with is to make sure that their infrastructure mirrors ours to a certain extent, or that we're able to monitor the food as it comes into the UK. And what generally happens is that both things are in place. So FERA will test food that's coming in from outside of the UK and check periodically that food is of a certain standard. And that's managed through organisations like DEFRA and the Food Standards Agency in the UK. But also we will encourage and hope and offer advice to countries wanting to bring products over to the UK over what the level of testing is that they need to do, and upskill them if needs be as well. There is occasion that we've had to go and train. I remember back to when we were first allowed various countries to come into the EU. Czech Republic and Cyprus were examples. We went over there to do some training. I spent a couple of weeks out there showing them how to do analysis on particular products, and that's something that we need to do to make sure that we can maintain these supply chains reliably and safely.
Food for thought.
China is by far and away the biggest producer of honey in the world, accounting for 28% of the world's honey, followed by Turkey at 6% and Iran at 5%. China also tops the charts in terms of total consumption of honey. But in terms of consumption as measured by head of population, well, that's a different story. For this, the winner is the Central African Republic, followed by New Zealand and Slovenia. Now, in this second slice of my conversation with Adrian Charlton, I started by asking him about manuka honey.
Manuka honey is a little bit of a pet project of mine. It's another one with a big market, and the main market it's listed as a herbal medicine in the Chinese pharmacopoeia, so it's got a big market in China. Manuka honey. It's produced in New Zealand, and that's pretty much the only place that can produce manuka honey from Leptospermum scoparium, which is the plant that produces it. It's something called a monofloral honey, so it's a honey where the nectar comes, the term is wholly or mainly, from one particular plant, and that plant's a manuka bush, which is called Leptospermum scoparium, as I said. The healing properties that it's purported to have, and this has never been proved scientifically, but it's one of those folklore things. We know that it's got antimicrobial properties. We've tested that in the lab quite extensively, and that's then been extrapolated to health benefits if you eat manuka honey. So it's found a premium market. That's where it stands out from pretty much any other honey. You can pay over £1,000 for a jar of manuka honey. It has very much a cult following, in as much as people who believe in the healing properties of manuka honey will pay big dollar for the product. So that's generated a fairly sizable market in terms of the value of the product.
So tell me a bit more then, Adrian. You mentioned there's sort of monofloral. Tell me a bit more about that.
So monofloral honey is defined in regulations actually as a honey that is made wholly or mainly from the nectar of one plant. So the bees will be visiting one type of plant. So you can imagine that if you put a beehive in the middle of a field that's only growing one particular crop, let's say rape, oilseed rape, then you would end up with a monofloral rape honey, because that's what the bees are feeding on. And we get that with things like manuka. So in New Zealand, there are plantations and places where people have actually deliberately grown manuka so that they can produce manuka honey, and they're very well managed. So the bee farmers will go out and they'll clear the land of any other type of flower to make sure that their final honey product is genuine manuka honey. I guess the opposite or the other side of that is a polyfloral honey. And most of the honey that we eat is polyfloral, so there's absolutely nothing wrong with that at all. But that tends to be from a mixture of different plant sources. So that's where the bees have had the opportunity to forage on many different types of flower, and the nectar from those different flowers come together into one product. So you can end up with something called a multifloral manuka honey, for example. But that's a blend of lots of different nectar types, including manuka. So what we're trying to do with the standards aspect of manuka is to try and define very clearly what a monofloral manuka honey looks like, and that involves managing the bee colonies probably a little bit more carefully than for some of the lower value products.
And now we've actually got a paths being developed around manuka honey in particular.
Well, as with anything that attracts a premium price, then other people try to cash in, and we found that there's been issues over the years with products being sold that are not manuka honey or only contain very small amounts of manuka honey, and they're not genuinely monofloral products. As I described, manuka should come from Leptospermum scoparium, and there are products that are not from that plant wholly or mainly. And so this PAS, the PAS sets out to define what manuka honey is in a way that can be measured. And that incorporates the regulations that are already in place in New Zealand, but it goes a bit further than that in establishing a standard for the product, and the safety aspects behind that are key. But it's mainly around authenticity. Have people blended a small amount of manuka with a different honey? but we talk about how you can test for that and use different scientific technologies to look at things like isotopes, but also biochemical markers that come out of the nectar. We can measure those and interpret whether we think a jar of honey is genuinely manuka, and all this is written into the standards. So it's a way that to take the PAS, a retailer, for example, who maybe was going to spend thousands of pounds, hundreds of thousands of pounds on a shipment of manuka honey, they could take that document and then say, look, does your product adhere to this standard? And can you provide with the evidence to prove that? And it's a way to give confidence that you're not buying a product that isn't what you think it is, and that ultimately passes down to the consumer as well. So whilst it's not a consumer-friendly thing to put on the outside of a jar of honey, I don't think at the moment, it's an assurance thing that it allows the industry to work in a way that protects the consumer.
And what's your personal involvement in the development of this particular standard, Adrian?
So the manuka's been an interest of mine for a while. So I'm the lead technical person. So I'm the technical author is a term that's used, and that involves coordinating a few people who are experts in the area to get the PAS written. And we're about halfway through that process at the moment. And yeah, we're hoping to have everything completed within the next few months or so. And that will be a good statement that the industry is coordinated around this standard, because that's a key thing. It's not just one person's opinion. So whilst I'm the technical author, this goes out to consultation, gives the opportunity for the market to have their opinion, and then ultimately the document is agreed across the industry. So you have an agreed standard that people will find that they can operate to and will elect into operate into.
I'm just thinking, sort of fast forwarding a couple of 2 or 3 years, thinking about this standard being used throughout the industry. What change or what impact do you think it will have for the industry itself, but also for consumers and retailers?
I think for consumers, ultimately, it will give you confidence. I think there's been a lot of bad publicity, and particularly there are certain newspapers that have enjoyed, I think, publishing articles suggesting that manuka honey has been adulterated in some way. And I think that probably puts people off sometimes, particularly with the high price point. But if people have been tempted to buy the product and the bad publicity has put them off, then this standard will make a clear statement that the industry is operating to a transparent and open standard, and that should give consumers confidence that the products that they're buying are genuine. The industry, I think, probably needs to promote the fact that they've developed this standard and that they've got everything together. There is a very strong industry body for manuka honey called UMFHA in New Zealand, and they're the sponsor of the PAS, so they're coordinating everybody together to make sure that the key industry operators are involved, but they will also be heavily involved with BSI and with FERA. And getting the message out there that this standard has been developed and it's actually being adopted as well.
Adrian, I asked you at the beginning about FERA's Science's involvement in standards and its work. You told me about your work with BSI, but what's been your own personal standards journey? How and when did it start for you, and where are you now?
Yeah, so the FERA was part of DEFRA. We're now still partly owned by DEFRA. So when I first started working at FERA, which was about 25 years ago now, we were always working around standards, but it was around regulatory standards. And so we've been working with DEFRA and the Food Standards Agency for a long time to look at whether legislation was right. And our job in that, and my personal job in that, was to manage the research and development work to provide evidence to government so that policymakers could make well-informed decisions. And that's really moved on and progressed because we've always recognised that there's a role for the private sector to be able to self-regulate, and that finding that mechanism for food has been quite difficult because there's additional costs involved and all of that sort of thing. So my journey has really been trying to take the message that we get from core government. We need to maintain high food standards. We need to maintain high animal welfare standards, and try and find a way that we can work with industry to achieve that in a way that's affordable and fit for purpose. And that's resulted in the work that we're doing with BSI at the moment. to try and develop standards for industry that carry the messages that we want as a society. So those bigger picture things, we all want higher animal welfare standards, to be maintained, and how can we assure that that's the case if we're importing meat from Australia or from New Zealand or from wherever else? But we can do that by looking at the regulations, but we can't impose regulations on other countries. What we can do is ask other countries to stick to standards that we've developed, and that's taking the best practice out of the regulatory frameworks, building that into an elected standard, and getting people to sign up to that. So that's my journey, is from the government side through to trying to get some kind of commercial implementation of these standards within the food sector.
So, Adrian, I've got to ask, since we've talked about honey a lot, and manuka honey in particular. Do you eat honey yourself?
I do. I even eat manuka honey. I'm not telling you whether I pay for it or not, but.
Are you one of those people that paid £1,000 for a jar?
Well, as you know, I'm from Yorkshire, so that's highly unlikely.
And are you a honey and tea or honey on toast? How do you take your honey?
So I would generally have manuka honey if I've got a cold or a sore throat, but I do believe that there's some benefit for any type of honey, not just manuka for when you feel a little bit under the weather, because it's got the right kind of properties to soothe the sore throat. But I like it. We put it in things like smoothies, so I'll blend it together with some fruit and some yogurt and that kind of thing. We've got children; they tend to enjoy it like that. My daughter has it on toast. We do get quite a lot of honey in our house. I think it's the general feeling is that it's better for you than refined sugar, and the children like sweet things, so we trying to encourage them to eat honey if that's what they need. A
nice alternative. I suppose as a final thought, runny honey or set honey? What's your view on that?
Oh, that's a whole contentious area. So in the UK, I think we've accepted runny honey, but that's one product that isn't quite as global as the set honeys that we see internationally. So. We generally would have, we would probably have both, actually, depending on what we were using it for. Runny honey we would put on breakfast cereals and that kind of thing, and then the set honey, a bit of a treat if we were having it on toast and that sort of thing.
So, Cindy Powerton, runny honey or set honey for you?
Runny honey, 100%. What about you?
I'm runny honey as well, although I have some in the cupboard upstairs, and after a sort of couple of weeks, it always becomes sort of set honey. Really? I don't know what's going on there. Yeah, does that happen for you?
No, I have my honey consistently stays runny. Yes, no, it does not crystallize. So, yeah.
Very good. And manuka honey? Ever tried that?
Yes, I love manuka honey. How about you?
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure if I've ever tried it, but obviously after recording this episode, I think I will definitely have to go and try it.
Must.
Although I'm not going to pay £1,000 a jar, as Adrian was mentioning. Yeah. Now, Cindy, we should say thank you to Adrian Charlton.
We should. And we should also say thank you to Sarah Walton from BSI too.
And if you can't get enough of honey, bees and standards, then check out episode 68 of the podcast, which we did for World Bee Day.
Great buzz for that episode. Great buzz.
So that's food consumption. And in the final episode in this series, we'll be looking at food waste management.
So, Matthew, we should probably start clearing up and getting ready for that then.
Very good. Now, I'm going to tuck in to my Bakewell tart, and what are you having again?
My date slice. It's
really very good actually. Very good, very good.
You have been listening to Farm to Fork, the relationship between standards and food, a series from The Standard Show. Subscribe to us now, wherever you get your podcasts.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.